Horror story. It was a crisp autumn evening, and the old schoolyard was alive with laughter and chatter as former classmates, some of whom hadn't seen each other in years, gathered for a long overdue reunion. It had been nearly a decade since they'd all last been together, and the air buzzed with the excitement of old friends reconnecting, sharing stories, and reliving memories of their shared past. The school had closed a few years after they'd graduated, and now the empty, echoing halls had taken on a sense of mystery and nostalgia. Some of them joked that the place looked haunted now, the broken windows and peeling paint adding to its eerie charm. The reunion was informal, a spontaneous gathering organized by a few classmates who had stayed in touch over the years. They set up a small picnic area near the entrance, bringing coolers filled with drinks and snacks, folding chairs, and an old speaker to play music from their teenage years. The laughter grew louder as the night went on, old cliques reformed, and people swapped stories of who had ended up where, who had married whom, and all the twists and turns life had taken since they'd left those halls. As the evening wore on, a group of them gravitated toward the old football field, where they'd once gathered after classes to talk, to laugh, and sometimes to nurse the bruises and scrapes from rowdy games. They laughed about the old days, sharing ghost stories they'd made up about the school back then, the kinds of stories that only seemed to surface after dark. But as they settled in, a strange sound echoed through the quiet night, coming from a storm drain on the far edge of the field. It was a low, metallic rattle like something scraping against the bars of the grate. The laughter died down, replaced by curious, uncertain glances as everyone turned to look. For a few seconds, there was nothing but silence, and then the sound came again. This time louder, more deliberate, like something was inside the drain, shifting and dragging itself against the metal. A few people chuckled nervously, brushing it off as just an old rusty grate groaning in the wind. But most of them couldn't shake the unsettling feeling that something was down there, something alive. They huddled closer together, watching the drain as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. The air grew tense, and a few people exchanged uneasy glances. Jokingly, someone suggested they'd stirred up a spirit with all their laughter and loud music, and for a moment, everyone laughed, letting the tension dissipate. Just as they were settling back into conversation, a loud thud echoed from the drain, followed by a dragging sound that sent chills down their spines. The laughter died instantly and people started to shift uncomfortably. A few murmured about heading back to the picnic area, and one by one they started to leave, glancing back over their shoulders as they walked away. Only one person stayed behind, Eric, one of the quieter classmates who had always been curious about the unexplained. He wasn't the type to scare easily, and he had always had a fascination for anything unusual or mysterious. He stepped closer to the drain, peering down, trying to make sense of the darkness below. As he crouched down, the smell of damp earth and rust filled his nose, and he squinted, trying to see if there was something moving down there. Shadows shifted below, murky and indistinct, and he felt a strange pull as if something was watching him, waiting. He shook his head, almost laughing at himself for being drawn in by something so ridiculous. But then, just as he was about to stand up, he felt a sudden, inexplicable tug. In an instant, his fingers lost their grip on the edge of the grate, and he felt himself being dragged downward. He struggled, twisting and kicking, but whatever had him was impossibly strong, pulling him toward the darkness. He gasped, feeling his fingers slipping as he tried to grab onto anything he could reach, but it was no use. He could barely scream before he was pulled completely out of sight. The others hadn't gotten far when they heard a muffled shout, followed by a chilling silence. They turned back, calling out for Eric, but there was no answer. Panic began to ripple through the group as they huddled together, staring at the empty spot where Eric had been just moments before. The silence was thick, suffocating, and nobody dared to approach the drain again. One of the classmates, visibly shaken, suggested they get a camera next time, set it up and see if they could capture whatever was hiding down there. It was a wild idea, but the fear and uncertainty gnawing at them made them desperate for answers. They decided, as they finally left the field, that they would come back another night, more prepared and less vulnerable. But as they walked away, each of them felt an unshakable dread. They knew they had to return, if only to find out what had happened to Eric, but the darkness seemed to close in around them, heavy with secrets and shadows that they couldn't quite escape. A week passed after Eric's disappearance, but the unease didn't leave his old classmates. The eerie, unnatural way he'd vanished lingered in everyone's minds, haunting their thoughts and even their dreams. Despite the fear, a sense of responsibility and curiosity had taken hold of the group. They had agreed, reluctantly and maybe even against their better judgment, to come back to the schoolyard that night, hoping they could learn something, maybe even find a trace of Eric. They had brought a camera as planned, setting it up near the storm drain with a grim resolve. The air was thick with apprehension as they gathered, a cold wind whispering through the abandoned field. As they huddled near the drain, someone broke the tense silence with a question that had been hanging in the air. "Do you think he's still down there?" Nobody answered immediately, their gazes shifting from one another to the dark, foreboding hole in the ground. The idea that something had taken Eric, that he could still be alive somewhere beneath their feet, was terrifying but also strangely hopeful. They weren't ready to give up on him, not yet. Then, as if in response to their questions, that same ominous sound echoed up from the drain. A scraping, metallic rattle, like something dragging itself along the bars, its presence unmistakable. The noise was louder this time, more insistent, almost like it was calling them. The group exchanged uneasy looks, fear tightening their faces as they huddled closer together. Jason, one of the more fearless boys in the group and someone who'd always been a bit of a daredevil, laughed nervously, trying to shake off the tension. "It's probably just an animal or something," he said, though his voice wavered. But he seemed to realize that no one believed him, least of all himself. In an attempt to lighten the mood, he pointed to a rotting pumpkin someone had brought along as a Halloween prank, the sort of thing they'd have laughed about back in school. "What if we toss this down there?" Jason suggested with a grin that was more forced than usual. "Maybe it'll spook whatever's hiding, scare it out or something." The idea sounded ridiculous, but they were desperate for anything that might give them some answers or, at the very least, break the terrifying silence. With a few hesitant nods, they agreed. Jason grabbed the pumpkin, lifting it over the drain. It was large, heavy, and covered in lumpy, mottled skin, its twisted stem adding to its grotesque appearance. The rest of the group held their breath as he positioned himself above the grate, ready to drop it in. Their camera was recording, its red light blinking like a beacon in the darkness, capturing every 10-second. "All right, here goes," Jason muttered, gripping the pumpkin tighter. With one last deep breath, he dropped it, letting gravity pull it down into the black void of the drain. There was silence for a heartbeat, then thud. It wasn't the sound of a pumpkin hitting concrete, nor the hollow echo they'd expected. Instead, it sounded as though it had been caught, snatched mid-fall. The noise was wet, sludgy, almost like something was swallowing it whole. The group recoiled, their nerves sparking with fresh terror. They stared at each other, faces pale, trying to understand what they'd just heard. Whatever was down there wasn't just an echo, it was alive. Then came a new noise, a sick, guttural crunching sound, like something gnawing and tearing at the pumpkin's thick skin. They could hear it chewing, devouring every piece, each bite sending shivers through their bones. The camera caught it all, the lens focused on the drain as the disturbing sounds echoed in the silent night. A flash of light appeared, barely visible but unmistakable. It was a dim, sickly glow, flickering from deep within the darkness of the drain, illuminating the walls like the glow of something burning from within. They all saw it, a strange, unnatural light that seemed to pulse with life, growing brighter with each passing second. And then they noticed it, a face. Just barely visible, its features distorted and monstrous, pressed against the grate as though it were peering out at them. The face seemed human at first, but as the glow intensified, the details twisted, stretched, becoming something that was anything but human. Its eyes were hollow, filled with an unnatural angry light that flickered like flames, and its mouth stretched wide, revealing jagged teeth slicked with orange pulp. The creature was devouring the pumpkin, gnawing and tearing at it with a ravenous hunger, its gaze locked onto the group with a dark, malevolent fury. Everyone stumbled back, horror freezing them in place as they watched this nightmarish figure devour the pumpkin, the light in its eyes growing brighter, more intense. Jason tried to laugh, but the sound caught in his throat, coming out as a terrified gasp. What is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crunching. One of the girls, Sarah, stifled a scream, her hand clamped over her mouth as her eyes filled with tears. They all wanted to run, to get as far from that place as possible, but something held them there, like a terrible magnetism that wouldn't let them look away. The creature seemed to know it had their attention, savoring each bite, each chew, as though mocking their fear. The camera caught every detail, every horrifying second of the creature's grotesque meal. Its face twisted with an expression of rage, and yet there was a strange satisfaction in the way it tore into the pumpkin, like it was feasting on more than just the fruit. With each bite, it seemed to feed on their terror, its glowing eyes burning brighter, filled with a dark, insatiable hunger. And then, without warning, it stopped. The chewing ceased, and the creature's face went still, its eyes narrowing as it stared directly into the camera. There was a moment of tense silence, broken only by the faint whir of the recording. Then, as if in slow motion, the creature's mouth twisted into a furious snarl, its jagged teeth dripping with pulp as it let out a roar, a scream so piercing, so filled with rage that it felt like a physical blow. The sound was unbearable, cutting through the air like a knife. It was a scream of anger, of pure hatred, and it shook them to their core. They stumbled backward, some of them covering their ears, others screaming along in fear. The scream echoed, bouncing off the empty walls of the schoolyard, filling every dark corner and shadowed crevice, amplifying until it felt like the earth itself was trembling. The camera recorded everything, the terrifying glow, the monstrous face, and the haunting scream that seemed to go on forever. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the scream stopped. The glow faded, the face disappeared, and silence fell over the field once more, an oppressive, suffocating silence that felt almost worse than the scream. They stood there, too shaken to move, each of them processing what they'd just seen. The camera's red light blinked steadily, capturing their terrified faces, the cold sweat on their brows, the horror etched into their expressions. Nobody spoke. They were too afraid, too overwhelmed to put their feelings into words. But in the back of their minds, one thought loomed, cold and certain. Whatever was down there wasn't finished. And it wouldn't stop until it had claimed every one of them.